TW, thank you. Ricky Nelson, his fiancée, and 5 members of his band died in that crash. 2 crew members did survive.
December 31st, 1985. A private aircraft cuts through the cold winter air above Texas, its engines humming against the silence of the night sky. Inside sits a man the world believed it knew, Ricky Nelson. The boy who grew up in America's living rooms, the teen idol who made girls scream and radio stations spin until their circuits burned. The musician who helped shape rock and roll itself without ever asking to become its poster child. On this night, Ricky wasn't chasing fame. He wasn't running from scandal. He was simply traveling to perform, doing what he had always done. Showing up, guitar in hand, sharing the only thing that ever truly belonged to him, his music. But the plane never made it. Smoke. Panic, a desperate descent, a violent impact that shattered more than metal. By morning, the world was flooded with headlines, and almost instantly the narrative formed itself like clockwork: drugs, recklessness, the downfall of a former star. The public accepted the story because it was easy, because it fit the tragic celebrity formula we've all been conditioned to believe. But easy stories are rarely true. What if the real cause of Ricky Nelson's death wasn't scandal, but negligence? What if the danger had been documented, reported, and ignored? And what if the most painful part of this story isn't how he died, but how preventable it was? The boy who never belonged to himself. Ricky Nelson was born into fame. Not just close to it, not adjacent to it, inside it. His parents, Ozzie and Harriet Nelson, weren't simply entertainers. They were symbols of a perfectly packaged American dream. Their home wasn't just a home, it was a set. Their conversations weren't just family discussions, they were scripts. And their children weren't just growing up, they were being watched. The adventures of Ozzie and Harriet didn't just make Ricky recognizable, it made him unavoidable. The show blurred the boundary between life and entertainment so seamlessly that even Ricky himself struggled to tell where the performance ended and the person began. America believed they were watching a sweet, wholesome, all-American family. And in some ways, they were. But they were also watching crafted moments, reshoots, carefully framed scenes designed to look natural. For Ricky, authenticity became a luxury he was never allowed to afford. Imagine being 5 years old and already aware that your smile is part of a brand. Imagine your childhood laughs being followed not by silence, but by applause. Imagine learning, before you learn who you are, how to sell who you are supposed to be. The public adored him, and why wouldn't they? He was irresistible on screen, soft-spoken, handsome, boyish. But while millions of people felt like they knew him, very few ever wondered whether he knew himself. That's the paradox Ricky Nelson lived with. Everyone loved him, but no one actually saw him. Behind the scenes, a quieter battle was unfolding. Ricky began to sense that every compliment, every cheer, every headline came with an unspoken condition. Stay who we think you are. Don't grow. Don't change. Don't surprise us. But childhood ends. Puberty hits. The personality evolves. The heart becomes more complex. And Ricky wasn't just a character. He was a human being trying to navigate emotions he was never allowed to express publicly. Was he the sweet teenage dream America wanted him to be? Was he the obedient son, performing a script someone else wrote? Or was he something entirely different, someone deeper, someone wounded, someone searching? The world never paused to ask. Ricky spent his life chasing one thing most people take for granted: the right to belong to himself. And the tragedy is this: he would spend decades trying to reclaim what fame took from him too early. A sense of identity, a voice of his own, and the freedom to be more than the image everyone else needed him to be. That unanswered question, who am I, really, would shape his music, his relationships, his downfall, and ultimately his legacy. The teen idol who reinvented music without trying to. In 1957, when Ricky was just 17, he stepped into a recording booth to sing "I'm Walkin'." The decision wasn't calculated. It wasn't a carefully orchestrated industry move. He didn't have a marketing team positioning him as the next big thing. He simply wanted to impress a girl. That was the level of innocence behind one of the most influential pivots in American pop culture. But the moment the song hit the airwaves, something extraordinary happened. His voice, smooth but earnest, confident but still undeniably young, did more than charm teenagers. It helped welcome rock and roll into living rooms that had previously rejected it as wild, dangerous, or morally corrupt. Ricky Nelson made rock music safe to love. He softened its edges without diluting its soul. And suddenly, the American household that had once resisted this new sound was singing along. Then the flood hit. Travelin' Man, Hello, Mary Lou, Poor Little Fool, Lonesome Town. These weren't just songs on the radio. They were emotional coordinates for a generation trying to figure out love, heartbreak, and identity. Ricky didn't scream, he didn't swagger, he felt. His music carried a quiet longing, like someone who had experienced too much too young. And audiences, even without knowing why, felt that too. He became a phenomenon. Teenage girls lined up outside theaters and hotel lobbies just to catch a glimpse of him. His face appeared on more magazine covers than political leaders, athletes, or actors combined. He wasn't just a star, he was the standard. But there is a cruel irony in being beloved for something accidental. Ricky's fame wasn't built on who he chose to be. It formed around who others needed him to be, the sweet boy next door. The soft-spoken heartthrob, the safe rebel, the soundtrack of teenage innocence. But children become adults. Voices deepen. Values shift. Curiosity expands. Pain accumulates. And Ricky, like anyone else, wanted to grow. But the world that adored him had no interest in his evolution. To them, he was frozen in time. Permanently 17. Permanently smiling. Permanently simple. Success built on a version of yourself that the world refuses to let change isn't success. It's a cage. The price of not staying who the world wants you to be. Music didn't just change in the 1960s. It exploded. The innocence of early rock gave way to distortion, protest anthems, counterculture, and experimentation. Guitars got louder. Lyrics got darker. Audiences wanted danger, edge, artists who bled on stage and broke rules off stage. The era demanded evolution, and Ricky, finally free from the boyish mold television had poured him into, wanted to evolve. He wasn't a wide-eyed teen anymore. He had lived heartbreak, pressure, identity loss, and the quiet ache of being misunderstood. The music inside him was deeper now, less about puppy love, more about longing, adulthood, even loneliness. But the world had other plans. Night after night, Ricky walked on stage, ready to share something new, something real. And every night, the same voices echoed back from the dark, play the old songs. Not as a request, as a command. He didn't just face disinterest. He faced rejection from the very people who once idolized him. Then came Madison Square Garden, 1971. A crowd of thousands. A stage that should have felt like home. Instead, it became a turning point. Ricky played his new music, country rock, introspective, sincere. The crowd responded not with applause, but with boos. A wave of disapproval so loud it swallowed the sound system. Imagine that. Booing the man who helped make the music they loved possible. Booing the artist who brought rock and roll into the mainstream when radio stations were still calling it noise. They didn't just reject his new music, they rejected his right to grow. That night carved a wound that couldn't be unseen. Ricky didn't scream, he didn't argue, he didn't explain himself. Instead, he wrote. And what came out was Garden Party, a quiet rebellion disguised as a gentle melody. A lyric that remains one of the most piercing declarations an artist has ever made. You can't please everyone, so you've got to please yourself. In that single line, Ricky set himself free. He stopped performing the version of himself that America demanded and started choosing authenticity, even if it meant stepping out of the spotlight that had once been so bright. But freedom has a price. When an artist stops serving nostalgia, the industry stops serving opportunity. Record labels lost interest. Radio stations moved on. The spotlight shifted to younger, louder, easier idols. Ricky didn't lose his talent. He lost permission to use it on his own terms. And that loss would shape everything that came after: acting, family, and the beautiful mess of being human. Ricky tried to outrun his image the only way he knew how, by proving that he was capable of much more than the teen idol the world insisted he still was. Hollywood offered him that chance. When he stepped onto the set of Rio Bravo in 1959, starring beside giants like John Wayne and Dean Martin, it wasn't just a movie role. It was a declaration. He could hold his own among legends. His performance was subtle, controlled, thoughtful, qualities that had nothing to do with fame manufactured by a family sitcom. For a moment, he wasn't performing Ricky Nelson the icon. He was performing Ricky Nelson the actor. He continued acting into the 1970s and 1980s, choosing roles that allowed him to show complexity, vulnerability, edges that had never been permitted on television. He wanted characters with conflict, confusion, depth, because that's who he was. And as his artistic choices matured, so did the gap between who the world thought he was and who he was desperately trying to become. Offstage, though, life was messier. He married Kristen Harmon, daughter of football legend Tom Harmon, and actress Elise Knox. Two American dynasties joined under one roof. Publicly, it looked like a perfect match. Beautiful, talented, adored. Privately, they were two young people still figuring out who they were, while the world watched, judged, and interpreted every move as symbolism. They had 4 children: Tracy, Sam, and twins Gunnar and Matthew. The twins would later start the band Nelson, carrying on their father's musical legacy, while also battling the same double-edged sword of inherited fame. Their home was filled with talent, yes, but also pressure, expectations, cameras, the unspoken demand to appear perfect, even when things were breaking. And things did break. Fame doesn't teach you patience, or communication, or how to protect your heart when crowds believe they own it. Ricky didn't know how to set boundaries because he had never been allowed to have any. The marriage strained under emotional wounds no one had ever taught him to express. Eventually, it fell apart. And with the end of the marriage came something unexpected: honesty. His music shifted. It grew quieter, rawer. There was melancholy in his voice now, not the scripted kind, but the kind earned through life. For the first time, Ricky was becoming himself. Not the boy America raised, but the man his experiences shaped. And just when he began to find that fragile identity, when clarity was finally within reach, fate stepped in and took everything away. The Flight. December 31st, 1985. Ricky Nelson was on tour again, not desperately chasing fame, not clinging to some fading spotlight, but simply doing what he loved. The crowds were still there. The music was still meaningful. And for the first time in a long while, life felt quieter, more grounded. He was reconnecting with his children, rebuilding trust, rediscovering the version of himself that didn't need to be perfect, just real. He boarded a 1946 DC-3 aircraft that night. The kind of plane that carried stories in its metal. Old, vintage, sentimental, almost romantic in the way nostalgia can sometimes disguise reality. Some called it classic. Some called it historic. But there's another word for machines that have outlived their era. Fragile. Charm can hide flaws. Age can hide danger. History can hide warning signs. Shortly after takeoff, something went wrong. Smoke began threading its way through the cabin, at first faint, like a whisper, then stronger, thick, unmistakable. The kind of smoke that tells you there is no time to think, only react. Passengers panicked. They tried to move, to breathe, to understand what was happening. The pilots, who would survive the crash, fought to control the descent, gripping controls they could barely see, choking through burning air. The plane went down near DeKalb, Texas, erupting into flames upon impact. Within minutes, the fire lit up the night sky. Within hours, the story lit up the world. But here is where the tragedy deepens. News cameras arrived before the ambulances. Microphones before medical crews. Headlines before facts. And when the media cannot explain, it does not wait. It invents. The rumors hit immediately. He must have been freebasing cocaine. He must have set the plane on fire. It was the final unraveling of a washed-up star. People believed these stories because they were simple, because they followed a familiar narrative, because the world loves a fallen idol more than a redeemed one. A tragic decline is easier to digest than a senseless loss. But then, something inconvenient happened. Science spoke. The autopsy revealed no cocaine. Not in his system. Not in his belongings. Not in his history leading up to the flight. His behavior that day had been normal, routine, clear-headed. He wasn't spiraling. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't lost. So the question becomes, if Ricky Nelson was not responsible for the fire, if drugs were not involved, if this was not a self-inflicted tragedy, then what caused the fire? And perhaps the even more unsettling question, why were people so quick, almost eager, to believe the lie? Was it because the truth was harder to accept? Was it because people prefer a clean narrative, even if it's false? Or was it because the real cause reveals something much uglier than scandal? Something systematic, something avoidable, something preventable? The real answer nobody wanted to touch. Years later, long after the headlines faded and the rumors lost their shock value, investigators finally began to re-examine what had actually happened. And when they did, something became clear. Something that hadn't been hidden, just overlooked. Maintenance logs, pilot testimonies, FAA safety reports, they all told the same story. Not a mystery, not a scandal, a pattern. The aircraft's heater system had been flagged repeatedly. Pilots had complained about it producing fumes. Mechanics had noted inconsistencies in heat output. One pilot even refused to fly the plane at one point unless the heater was inspected. But instead of full replacement, a costly and time-consuming repair, quick patches were applied, temporary fixes, bandages on a wound that needed surgery. The heater system didn't just malfunction, it leaked fuel vapor. Fuel vapor is one of the most dangerous substances inside an aircraft. You cannot see it. You cannot smell it. It is silent and patient. It doesn't need flames. Just heat. Just friction. Just one spark. During Ricky's final flight, that heater ignited a fire beneath the cabin floor. The passengers weren't surrounded by fire at first. They were surrounded by toxic smoke. Thick, oxygen-stealing fumes that render a person unconscious before they even realize something is wrong. By the time the pilots attempted an emergency descent, the cabin was already filled with smoke dense enough to overwhelm anyone inside. Ricky Nelson and the others likely slipped into unconsciousness before the plane hit the ground. No panic, no struggling, just a quiet surrender to the smoke. They did not suffer, but they should not have died, because the warnings were there, in writing, filed, signed, initialed. Someone knew, multiple people, in fact, and every single one of them assumed someone else would handle it. This wasn't a tragic mystery. This was negligence, preventable, documented, ignored. And that is the truth that took decades to surface. Not because it was hidden, but because it was inconvenient. There is no scandal here, no dramatic downfall, no sensational headline, just human failure. Ricky Nelson's story is not one of downfall. It's one of endurance. A boy placed under lights before he understood what shadows were. A young man trying to breathe inside a role the world applauded, but never bothered to ask if he wanted. A musician who kept evolving even when audiences begged him to stay the same. And a father who, despite the chaos around him, left behind children who would carry forward not just his name, but his courage to create honestly. He was never a cautionary tale. He was a reminder that fame does not equal identity, that applause does not equal love, and that being seen is not the same as being understood. He spent his life peeling back the layers that fame had glued to him, slowly uncovering the core he had been searching for since childhood. And he found it, not in sold-out arenas, not in magazine spreads, but in music that sounded like truth instead of expectation, in the laughter of his children, in the simple peace of being himself when no cameras were rolling. His death doesn't define him. The negligence that took him doesn't overshadow the resilience that carried him. The lesson he leaves behind is simple, but powerful. You cannot shape your life around who others want you to be. You cannot survive by performing your identity. You have to choose yourself. Ricky Nelson did. And in doing so, he finally became real, on his own terms.